Welcome to the Nature Photo Guys podcast,
where we talk about nature photography, from gear to our philosophies and everything in between.
So grab a cup of coffee, sit back and relax.
You're listening to Joe Desjardins
and Chris Gibbs, the Nature Photo Guys. Hey Joe, how's it going this week?
Not too bad, Chris. How are you?
Not too bad. Dealing with a bit of the smoky Calgary air. The smokes come in from the West Coast, but nowhere near as bad as the West Coast has been dealing with, that's for sure.
Yeah, no kidding. I'm just happy to see it as it is. You can kind of see a little bit of it, but can't really smell it all that much. It hasn't really affected I hope it hasn't really affected too many people's breathing. So
not here in Calgary anyway. I know my family lives in Kelowna, and I got other family in interior BC, and it's just socked in. It's absolutely they can't even see anything even there. So anyway,
we've been pretty lucky this year for that.
We sure have.
Out this way here,
we've had worse years for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So you've got a few comments you want to address.
Absolutely. We had a few comments this past week about our last episode. And Celine, first of all, I should remind everybody the last episode 7, we talked about manual mode and auto ISO, using those in tandem, right? Mm-hmm. So basically she said, great job, guys. I've just started shooting this way, and especially for birds moving in and out of shadows, it works great. And she says she has to admit she's capped her ISO at 6400, but she may take the risk and move that up. Sweet.
Yeah. So she's aware of where her ISO is at, what's acceptable, what's not really acceptable, and everything else. That's good to hear. I'm glad. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, it kind of sums up exactly what we were talking about last episode, right? So she seems to know what she's going after there with her ISO on her camera for sure.
And that's a perfect example, because whenever you take your camera and point in a different direction, the light's changed.
That's right. Yes, exactly. Moving in and out of shadows and all that.
It really helps, right? So awesome.
Yeah, for sure. And Dana has stated, I watched a few episodes and found them very informative. So that's what we like to hear. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks very much for that. Appreciate it. So this week's topic?
Exposure compensation.
Yeah, that's a good one. I use it and I don't, right? I mean, it's one of those things that you use when you need to use it.
Yeah. Yep.
So I guess we should explain what exposure compensation is to start with.
Good idea.
Basically, what it does is it makes your pictures lighter or darker, right?
That's a fair statement.
It's the easy explanation. And I guess I should explain why, right?
Okay.
I mean, so essentially the way the camera exposes an image is it's based off of tonality, right? 18% gray. And I don't mean the color gray. I just mean the tonality of what 18% gray is. For those of you that used to shoot film back in the day and use a light meter and take meter readings off of a gray card, that's the reason for it, right? So
right, that gray card was 18% gray.
That's right, exactly. So you'd use it, take a meter reading off of that, and then you'd have your exposure. You'd have your exposure bang on, right? So, so today's cameras, what they do is they base the exposure off of 18% gray, but a lot of times, the camera's doing its job, but it's not the exposure you want, right? So, for instance, if you're shooting in, let's say, in snow, what it's trying to do is create an exposure based on 18% gray. So what's it going to do to white, bright snow? It's going to make it look flat and mucky, bringing it down to 18% gray. So this is where you use exposure compensation to override what the camera's doing and bringing the exposure back to the way you see it, right? So in this case here, in snow, sometimes you have to add a stop and a half, sometimes 2 stops of light, to bring the exposure back. And what I mean by stops, if you look at your exposure compensation, like a meter, the ruler, right? I'm adding to the right. So I'm going to the right +1, +1.5, +2, okay?
Right, on the positive side.
On the positive side. So everything to the right makes things brighter. Everything to the left makes things darker, right?
Yes.
So the bright side example is the snow. And let's say the dark side example is a full frame of a black bear, okay?
Yes. Good example.
So full frame of a black bear, what the exposure is going to do is it's not going to be true black. It's going to head towards gray, right? A lighter black, right? So in this case here, what you do is you'd use your exposure compensation to go to the left, maybe a half a stop or a full stop to the left to bring the blacks back up to black.
Right. More
Right?
negative numbers rather than the
That's
positive.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And in a nutshell, that's what exposure compensation is. Like it's basically what you're doing to bring the exposure, balance the exposure back to what you see, and basically override what the camera is trying to do. So,
Right,
yeah.
because that's really like my discussion with a lot of people who are just learning. The cameras can't always show you what you can see, right? So you have to play with the settings to make sure it brings you back to what you're seeing.
And that's with the DSLRs.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And so we're going to touch on that, right? So
Yeah.
DSLRs, when you're looking through the camera, what you see is not what you get.
No.
So, with experience, you kind of know that, or what you could do essentially with the DSLR is take a photo, look at the histogram or look at the back exposure, and okay, it's underexposed, make my exposure compensation set adjustments, and then shoot again. Right.
Yes.
And I wouldn't really recommend just looking at the LCD, but looking at the histogram. Right.
Okay. Exactly. Yeah.
Things are bang on. So that's a DSLR. And for most of you over the last 10, 15 years have been using a DSLR, not a mirrorless, right? Okay. So something that you've learned with experience that, in these type of scenarios, you almost automatically go, like if I'm shooting in snow, I pretty much automatically go to +1, 1.5, and then make slight adjustments from there. Because
Sure.
you just, especially when the snow encompasses most of the frame. Now, you got to watch, because even though you're in a bright scene, if you've got a full frame image of an elk, well, now the scene isn't overly bright, right? Now, so you just really got to pay attention, right?
Yes.
And with practice and time, it becomes almost second nature.
Well, and
right?
I was going to say it probably was second nature to you more or less when you back in the film days, right? Because you couldn't take a photo and check to see if it's correct. You had to know your camera and get used to that. So it probably is just rolling into the DSLRs. It's become a little bit of second nature as well with you, I suppose.
Well, and that's right, because back in the day shooting film, there was no compensation at all as far as exposure goes. Like if you just shot true in camera what the meter said,
yeah,
it was fingers crossed when you saw the film. You know what I mean? Like
right.
with the slides.
Yeah, exactly.
If you shot print film, well, little did you know that a lot of times when you were underexposed or overexposed, the lab fixed it.
Oh yeah,
and gave you a print, right? Because they could tell from the negative. Because I used to work in a lab.
Yeah,
you could tell by the negative whether it was overexposed or underexposed.
Right.
And so you would make the compensations on the machine, and print out a print. So sometimes you had to, stop and have 2 stops over on a print to give them a proper photo, but most people didn't realize that you were doing that.
Right. Yeah,
okay.
For sure.
So you really got to pay attention.
Nice of you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was just your job, right? You just
exactly.
Looking at negatives thousands of times, you just kind of knew what,
sure.
what to do, right? So
yes.
Now with mirrorless cameras, what you're seeing is what you get.
Yes. WYSIWYG.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So how nice is that? So basically you bring the camera up to your eye, right?
Yeah.
And if it's dark, engage the exposure comp and turn to the right until you get the exposure you want and click the button.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
you can see it.
It's amazing. It's absolutely, it's a game changer when it comes to exposure. I mean, you really shouldn't have any excuses for a poorly exposed image. I mean, it happens, but for the most part, if you're sitting there taking your time, paying attention, especially with the landscape stuff and macro stuff, really there isn't,
right.
But sometimes when you get caught up in the wildlife stuff's happening, whatever, you hit a button, stuff can happen. Right. So,
or accidentally leave your exposure compensation knob turned to +3 or something like that, or whatever, right?
Yeah, so, and you should normally see that, but you get caught up in the excitement, and sometimes you get a bunch of blown out images, right? So, so one of the huge advantages to mirrorless, right? So it was kind of weird for me because, with a mirrorless camera, essentially you're looking through a video recording, right?
You
You
are.
know,
Yep. Yeah. It's like an
and
LCD screen you're looking through, really. Yeah.
that's right. And
Yeah.
it was really weird for me in the beginning to do that. I was like, man, this is like a game changer, right?
Yeah.
Little do you have to really, I mean, you still kind of know shooting into a winter scene, you're going to have to make an adjustment, but
Yes, that's for sure.
you see it, you know, so it's awesome. And
it's almost a reminder, right? You see it and you go, oh yeah, that's right. I do have to make an adjustment before you even worry about it. Right. So
for sure. And so you had mentioned earlier, to get a little bit off topic, why do we use exposure comp? Well, to get it right in camera.
Yes. Rather than in post, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're telling me, what were you telling me earlier?
Yeah, I was telling you earlier that some people haven't even used exposure compensation. In fact, some of the cameras, like for example, I have the Fuji camera right here. The exposure compensation button is actually a knob right on the camera. Some people are saying, why is that wasting space on my camera? Why is it even there? Right? They don't know. They don't know maybe what it does, right? Or what it's doing to help you.
I'm a big proponent of always getting it right in camera, right? Yeah. I've always been. And one of the disadvantages of thinking that Photoshop's going to save your pictures is it's such a wrong way of thinking.
It's a bad habit to get into, right?
It is. And I'll give you one example. When you underexpose an image, okay, you're not using exposure comp, you've underexposed an image, you bring it into Photoshop or Lightroom, and you try to brighten it, open it up, okay? Yep. Well, what you're doing, and especially in the dark, like the dark shadows, the blacks, what you're actually doing is you're introducing color noise, and it's getting a little bit on the grainy side.
That's right. Yes, it is.
Like you're introducing stuff that shouldn't be there. Whereas if you would have got it right in camera, sure, you're slightly off maybe a third of a stop. You're always going to do a little bit of that fine tweaking stuff, right?
Yep.
But for the most part, if you don't make those adjustments in the camera, you're going to have problems after, especially if you're, the software is really good. You can usually recover up to 3 stops on either side, right?
Right. Yeah.
But you're affecting the image quality, right?
Yes.
So,
yeah.
So think about that next time when you're thinking, oh, I'll just let my camera,
I'll fix it in post, right?
Or I'll fix it in post, right? Yeah, and I'll just let the camera shoot the way it is. It sees it, right? So.
Well, that's what I was going to say. That the thing is, yes, in the shadows, in some cases, you can bring some stuff back. Yes, you introduce noise, but like you said, on the flip side, if you go just too far and it's overexposed just that much, there's nothing to bring back because there's nothing, it's too overblown. There's no detail left. It's gone. That's right.
Yeah. So you're going to have, so it works both ways. So if it's underexposed, you're not going to be able to bring detail back in the shadows, right? The blacks are going to be black. And the same when you overexpose, right? You're going to blow out the highlights and there's going to be no detail in highlights. So nothing to bring back. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's why I think it's important to get it right in camera. Exposure compensation is huge. And I mean, there's days I never use it. The light's pretty even and, you're shooting neutral scenes and everything else. And I mean, that's great, but.
You probably used it in Churchill quite a bit.
Yeah. My camera was set, plus 1.5, I think almost the entire trip. Time. You know what I mean? White snow, white bears. Like, exactly. Oh my God. Well, here's a little thing too. Like back in the day when I used to shoot weddings, okay? You got a white bride and a black groom, right? And I mean, their clothing, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So who do you expose for?
Right.
It's always the bride.
I was going to say it's the bride.
It's always the bride. Always the bride. The guy's black tux can go black. Who cares?
Yes.
If you don't show detail in that dress, you're done. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So, but
done in the city entirely. You're not getting a job again.
Exactly. So there's an extreme example where you got whites and blacks in the same scene. But I mean, you can usually do pretty good, balancing the exposure in that case there when you're bringing in extra light and whatever else, right? But
fair enough. Yeah.
But that's an extreme example. So, yeah.
So, Joe, I have a question for you regarding backlit items. If you're in the field and you see a black bear coming at you or any animal, really, an elk, whatever, and the lighting is behind the animal. So the sun's coming through and the animal is backlit. Yeah. Do you adjust your exposure compensation at that scenario?
Nope.
You
you're
don't
done.
touch it. Oh, you're done.
Well, if you got, I mean, there's only some limitations, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like basically 3 stops ain't going to do really much. What you're going to do is you're going to overexpose the bears, like to the point where it's going to look mushy.
Okay.
So what's happening is the exposure compensation is entirely across the scene.
Right.
So if you're trying to expose for the bear by opening it up, right, like adding light, what you're doing to the sun in the background is you're blowing out the background.
Everything else in the background. Right? Yeah. You can't really mask it out, right?
that exactly. So that's another good point. You have to be aware of what you're shooting and what's important in the scene, right?
Yeah.
So whether you're shooting wildlife or people, like it really depends. If a subject is side lit, whether it be an animal or a person, obviously the person is always going to be the focus. If it's a portrait, I mean, sometimes you want to create a silhouette. In that case, there you underexpose.
Yeah, I was about to say the exact same thing.
Sometimes you want rim lighting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes you want that rim light on a subject or a wildlife or something like that. In that case, there you underexpose purposely, right?
Yes.
If the light's not bright enough to create the exposure the way you want it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It may not underexpose it enough to the point where you want it a certain way, right? So you can get very creative with your exposure compensation. I mean, you could create a high key. I know this is going off topic, but when you're shooting portraiture, in those types of situations, you can actually create a high key portrait where you purposely blow out the background.
Right. Yeah. Fair enough.
Right? And lighting the subject with flash, it just, I mean, it's unlimited what you can do. But generally we're using exposure compensation to get a good exposure so we can tweak it in post and, do what you want with it later. So.
Yeah, and I was going to say one of the Canon cameras that I have, when you hit the exposure compensation, you think you are, but you're actually controlling the flash compensation. So just be careful what compensation meter you're
some
adjusting.
Of the older ones,
right?
Yeah, that's right.
Because it says exposure compensation, but it says compensation, but it's flash compensation versus exposure compensation. So just be careful that you're altering the correct one. So if you're altering the flash compensation, you have no flash, you may not be doing anything.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I think most cameras nowadays, the exposure comps on the right, and it's really at a good spot, where it's either the first or second button. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's usually exposure comp and ISO, or you know what I mean? Like it's depending on the camera, right? So, and in your case there with the Fuji, it's a dial, right?
Yeah, and actually the Fuji for everything. So the ISO is on the left-hand side. The ISO dial is on the left-hand side. The aperture control is actually on the lens for most of the lenses, not everything. Some of the cheaper lenses, you have to go in menu, but the lenses that I have, the aperture controls here. Yeah. And the shutter speed dial is right here as well. And then the exposure compensation button is right beside it. So all the buttons are nice and handy right there for me to access everything. So it's quite good, quite user friendly for that. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Chris, I think that's it. I think we could wrap up this episode. We covered exposure comp and the reasons for it.
Agreed.
And if anybody does have any questions or comments, be happy to answer them in the next episode. So certainly leave them on our podcast or our Facebook page or our YouTube channel.
Sounds good. Absolutely. And you have an event coming up.
The Etobicoke Camera Club in Toronto. We're doing a live webinar /seminar on it's called Crazy About Wildlife Photography. It's an Eventbrite event, and it's on September 28th from 5 to 8 p.m. Mountain Standard Time.
People can buy tickets for that event? Yeah,
people can buy tickets for it. They're $10. And you can get the Eventbrite link on my on the Nature Photo Guys podcast page and on my Facebook pages for sure. Links there. And if you don't see it anywhere, guys, just email me or drop a message, and I'd be happy to send you the link.
Sounds great, Joe. That's great.
Okay, cool. So I think we'll wrap things up, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks. Bye for now.
You've been listening to the Nature Photo Guys podcast. If you have any questions, contact us at info@thenaturePhotoGuys.ca or message us on Facebook and Instagram at the Nature Photo Guys podcast. Make sure you listen to all our new episodes on www.thenaturePhotoguys.ca or visit your major podcast providers, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We'll catch you next time on the Nature Photo Guys podcast.